back. We are about to begin the second session of the seminar titled Tributes and Poetry Reading. Professor Nilofar Bharuchaji will chair this session. I invite Professor Bharuchaji onto the stage. Professor Bharuchaji's most updated introduction is she had inaugurated the first Centenary seminar in Nissim Ezekiel.
That's right.
The participants in this session, Vinita Agrawalji, I invite Vinita Agrawalji. Vinita Agrawalji's latest collection of poems, Artha, published by Sahitya Akademi, which is hot off the press. Published by Sahitya Akademi, which is a collection of eco-poems. Her book, Dry Light Language, won the Proverbs Prize Hong Kong 2021. She has authored 6 books of poetry. She was awarded the Rabindra Tagore Literary Prize 2018 and the Gayatri Ramarsh Memorial Award for Literary Excellence, the United States of America in 2015, and a special mention in the Hawker's Prize 2019. Her work was shortlisted for the inaugural Dipankar Shivani Memorial Prize 2021. She co-edits the yearbook series of Indian poetry in English. She has edited 2 anthologies on climate change, Open Your Eyes in 2020 and Count Every Beat in 2023. Based in Indore, her work has been widely published and anthologized. She is on the advisory board of the Tagore Literary Prize and is co-chair for the Global Council for Excellence for Environment and Sustainability. She was one of the 20 poets to be featured in a documentary on Asian poets titled Deepest Uprising, made in Taiwan. She is a keen birder and an amateur photographer. So we have bird watcher, poet, and a photographer here. Our next participant in this session is Radha Chakravartiji. I request Radha Chakravartiji to please come on the stage. Radha Chakravartiji is a poet, critic and translator based in Delhi. She was Professor of Comparative Literature and Translation Studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She has published more than 20 books, including the Essential Tagore nominated book of the year 2011 by Martha Nussbaum. Mahashweta Devi, writer, activist, visionary, and feminism and contemporary women writers, and novelist Tagore. She has translated Tagore's Gora, Chokher Bali, Boyhood Days, Farewell Song, 4 Chapters, and The Land of Cards. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Kapal Kundak, Qazi Nazrul Islam's Selected Essays, and Mahashweta Devi's Our Shanti Niketan, and In the Name of the Mother, nominated for the Crossword Translation Award 2004. She has edited Vermilion Clouds, Stories by Bengali Women, and Crossings, Stories from Bangladesh and India, and several anthologies of South Asian writing. Sublime Poems is her debut volume of poetry. She contributed to Pandemic, a worldwide community poem, News by Press, the United States of America, nominated for the Pushkar Prize 2020. The next participant in this session is Anjana Naira Dev. Please come on. Anjana Devji is Associate Professor of English at Gargi College, University of Delhi. She is profoundly interested in dynamics of the undergraduate classroom. Her areas of research interest include comparative education, pedagogy in tertiary education, assessment and evaluation, Indian writing in English, poetry and fiction, English for special purpose, academic writing, creative writing, technical writing, and business communication, detective and crime fiction, and teaching English in the Indian classroom. She has published extensively in these areas. I welcome the chair and the participants and request the chair to please open this session.
Thank you, Sahitya Akademi, for organizing this beautiful seminar on Nissim Ezekiel in the centenary year of his birth. And I think it's almost 2 decades since he passed away, so that is also significant in a sense. I'd like to take this on another tangent because we have a book coming out on Nissim. It's a it's a kind of a memoir put together by his daughter Nissim Ezekiel and it's been edited by me. But my role as an editor for this book was very different from that role of a conventional editor, because the book is a very emotional tribute from a daughter to a father, from Kavita to Nissim. And she's the one who's chosen the contents and the people whom she wants to be included in the book. A lot of the Bombay poets are there. And my main contribution to that book is in the form of a foreword, which I also became very emotional when I wrote it, because when the book comes out and if you get a chance to read it, you'll see that she's revealed extremely poignant details of her years growing up, with almost in the absence of her father, where she said that in the interview this morning that Nissim Ezekiel didn't have the time for his family always, which is the case with many artists and creative personalities. So somehow I was very emotional when I wrote that foreword, and today I'm going to read out bits and pieces of the foreword and certain poems which I found worth quoting in that foreword. So I'd like to begin with 2 lines from Nissim Ezekiel's poem, Background Casually. Go, words, on your difficult mission. Go, words, on your difficult mission. Understand that all your sounds are ominous. A few months ago, I received a proposal from Kavita Ezekiel Mendonca, Nissim Ezekiel's daughter, to edit a memoir anthology on her father to mark his centennial birth anniversary. I had studied Ezekiel's poetry in school and college, and I remember this very clearly because when my English reader or the English textbook, literature textbooks would arrive in the summer holidays, even before school began, I would have finished it from front to end. And when I was in class 8 when I read Night of the Scorpion by Nissim Ezekiel, and I remember Mrs. Carr was our English teacher. And I simply couldn't get past that poem, the kind of imagery it generated through words that just stayed with me. And that also marked my own foray into writing poetry in English. I had studied Ezekiel's poetry in school and college, and the unforgettable imagery in his verses had stayed with me throughout my life. I'd never met the poet in person, and I never ever met him, unfortunately. That's something I regret. So editing a memoir on him, compiled by his daughter, seemed like redemption, the next best way to getting to know this iconic poet. I accepted Kavita's offer readily, and I'm so glad I did, because the book has emerged as a deeply moving patrimony of sensitive insights into the life and mind of Nissim Ezekiel and his poetry, of course. The book is about to be released soon by the publishers Bhavan Books and Media. I'd like to quote a paragraph from a foreword. The actual experience of editing this deeply moving patrimony, compiled with admirable honesty by Kavita, was more than I'd bargained for. I imagined I'd get to know Nissim better through this manuscript, but I hadn't anticipated the singular welling of emotions towards Kavita in the course of reading these pages. Kavita, who bared her deepest vulnerabilities in her recounting of her life with her father. The section where she narrates how at the age of 10, when her parents had separated, her mother insisted that she go and live with her father, and bundled her into a taxi, made me pause and take a deep breath. It couldn't have been easy to have a choice, to have no choice in the matter. So imagine a young girl of 10 being bundled into a taxi and being sent to her father's place and asked to live with him, because the children had been divided as the parents had gotten divided. The year 2024 marks 100 years of Nissim Ezekiel's birth, and the 9th of January this year marked 2 decades of his passing. Ezekiel was a foundational figure in India's post-colonial literary history. He is, with a broad consensus, considered to be the father of Indian poetry in English. He was a prolific poet, playwright, critic, broadcaster, and social commentator. Nissim Ezekiel's contribution to the world of English verse is significant, and in fact directed the pathways that Indian poetry in English has taken since then. Although he wrote in English, and despite being a Bene Israel Jew, Ezekiel's writing was essentially Indian in identity and hope. His words reflected the sum total of Indian culture and the deep-seated political, economic, secular, and spiritual norms in India. Ezekiel lived mostly in Mumbai, known as Bombay at that time, for most of his lifetime. However, he did travel to various corners of the world. Despite his rich exposure to global culture, we see that Ezekiel's work sought to intensely explore ideas that would lead to the social betterment in his adopted country, that is India. In fact, Ranjit Hoskote, an eminent and acclaimed Indian poet and art curator, and someone who regards Ezekiel as his mentor, says, Nissim was a path-breaking, this I quote, Nissim was a path-breaking poet in the Anglophone Indian context. Across the arc of his career, he maintained an accomplished ability to work with metrical structures while being responsive to the cadences of the spoken voice and registering the demotic forms of English as they evolved in post-colonial India. His very Indian poems, quote-unquote, which some observers have regarded as evidence of snobbery, are in fact deeply moving sympathetic accounts of middle-class urban life, its dilemmas and difficulties, and the manner in which language is remade to suit experience. A close attentiveness to the wisdom traditions, Talmudic, Biblical, Upanishadic, and Buddhist, was a lifelong feature of his sensibility and his poetry. From the 1970s onwards, his poetry was shaped by a compelling desire to bring poetic utterance into accord with the stoic, compassionate, empathetic view of the world. Nissim was always the witness to change both inward and worldly, intimate and historic. End quote. I'd like to expand a little more on the Upanishadic aspect of that Hoskote mentions in Ezekiel's poetry. One of the hallmarks of Ezekiel's oeuvre is his engagement with the spiritual and philosophical heritage of India. In his poem Enterprise, he pays homage to the Upanishads, the ancient Indian texts that delve into the nature of reality and the self. Ezekiel's reverence for these scriptures is evident as he contemplates the essence of existence. And I quote from his poem, "I cannot live here. The air is too full of uproar, and the gods are too old." This tribute to the Upanishads unveils Ezekiel's deep connection with India's spiritual traditions. By intertwining the ancient wisdom of the Vedas with contemporary poetic expression, he bridges the temporal gap, affirming the enduring relevance of these timeless philosophical texts. Ezekiel's poetry possesses a visceral quality that captivates readers and brings his words to life. Perhaps Nissim Ezekiel is an alien, insider, often raped by the crisis of identity, the dichotomy splitting him into refuting his base as a Beni Israel, making his home in India. To read him is to question the eternal existential identity crisis. Is he an Indian or a Beni Israel? How to corroborate his Indianness? A poet, he is of the modern age, of the urban space. Bombay is his city where he was born, where he grew up, lived, and passed his days apart from a sojourn in England for his studies. But he knows karma and dharma, the fruits of bhoga, and that one suffers for one's actions. These myriad philosophical questions are addressed in his verses. And I'm going to read this poem titled Tribute to the Upanishads, which goes like this. To feel that one is somebody is to drive oneself in a kind of a horse. The destination is obvious. I don't want to be the skin of the fruit, or the flesh, or even the seed, which only grows into another wholesome fruit. The secret locked within the seed becomes my need, and so I shrink to the nothingness within the seed. At first it is cold, I shiver there. Later comes a touch of truth, a ferment in the darkness, finally a teasing light. For the present, this is enough, that I am free to be the self in me, which is not somebody, not at any rate the mortal me, but the eye of the eye that is trying to see. The eye of the eye is a metaphoric description to denote the power of discerning. Ezekiel's poetic exploration was influenced by English modernists, a literary movement that emerged in the early 20th century. The impact of Eliot, Yeats, Pound, Philip Larkin is quite discernible in Ezekiel's work. In The Night of the Scorpion, echoes of Eliot's modernist techniques, such as fragmented narratives and symbolic imagery, resound to create a textured and subtle reading experience. In the same poem, Ezekiel narrates an incident in which an Indian village woman is stung by a scorpion on a rainy night. Through the poignant portrayal of rural superstitions and a mother's gratitude that the scorpion spared her children, the poet portrays the collective identity of the community in the face of adversity. And I quote from the poem, "May he sit still," they said. "May the sins of your previous birth be burned away tonight," they said. "May the poison purify your flesh of desire and the spirit of ambition. Thank God the scorpion pricked in me and spared my children." Ezekiel skillfully adapts modernist techniques to the nuances of Indian society, making his poetry a unique product of Western literary forms and indigenous themes. Modernist influences shaped his creative odyssey for well over 5 decades. In fact, the huge bulk of his writing, creative as well as critical, evidences a receptive personality open to assimilating various impacts and influences. Ezekiel confesses that some of my early poetry was influenced by Rilke. I did not succeed in assimilating this and eventually discarded it. I have imitated Eliot, Pound, Yeats, and others, but never very well. My own voice has often been muffled or confused by random and temporary influences. That is the main weakness of my voice. A clear influence is no proof of a poem's merit. Quite the contrary, I was not influenced by Yeats after The Unfinished Man, nor by Eliot and Pound after 60 poems. I don't feel I make the grade to talk of influences at all. All this talk of influences may be of some value only when I write good poetry during the next 10 years or so, which I certainly hope to do. End quote. Ezekiel's literary journey mirrors the complexities of post-colonial identity. In The Professor, he reflects on the challenges of balancing tradition and modernity, and I quote a stanza from the poem Professor. "The young men on the government road are too slow, and those in the university are too fast. So I go to the middle class that flows through my heart." In conclusion, Nissim Ezekiel's contributions to English poetry grew out of his ability to navigate the complexities of cultural identity. His sharp wit, his linguistic prowess, which together established him as a literary luminary. Ezekiel's poetry remains an enduring testament to the intricacies of the post-colonial Indian experience, and his legacy as a father of English poetry in India continues to inspire generations of readers and writers alike. His contributions to English poetry in India extend far beyond his recognition of the father of English poetry in a country, his tribute to the Upanishads, the visceral quality of his words, the exploration of identity, and the influence of English modernists collectively shape the rich tapestry of his poetic legacy. Through his words, he not only captures the essence of a changing society, but also contributes to the global dialogue on literature, demonstrating that the quest for identity is a universal exploration that transcends borders and resonates with readers across time and space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinita. And I now Thank you, Vinita. And I now request Radha Chakravarti to make her presentation. Do we have questions at the end of the session, or would you like to have some very urgent things which you must ask Vinita immediately that we will end this lecture? Okay, all right.
Can you hear me? I want to thank Sahitya Akademi for asking me to speak at this forum. When I was invited, I said that I don't really have the right to be here because I'm neither an expert on Indian English poetry nor a scholar of Nissim Ezekiel's poetry. But Professor Malashri Lal said that this is a session on tributes and poets can pay their tribute in the form of their own poetry, which is what I will mainly do here. And thank you very much for including me here in spite of my lack of expertise on the subject. I do want to recall though two things. One is my encounter with Nissim Ezekiel in the early 90s when as a younger teacher in Gargi College, University of Delhi, I invited him to talk to us and to read and present his poems to our students. And at that time I corresponded with him, and one of my treasured possessions is an indent letter. We don't have indent letters anymore. I don't know if everyone here even knows what an indent letter is, but I have a very precious indent letter written to me by Nissim Ezekiel, expressing happiness and accepting the invitation and talking about what he would like to say and do during the session and so on. So that was the contact I had with him before he came to the college, where he was a great hit with everyone and he read his poems in his own inimitable style. I've never heard anyone read Nissim Ezekiel the way Ezekiel read Ezekiel. I've never heard, his intonations, his use of accents, the way he brought in the colloquial idiom and the sound of his poetry. I've never heard his poems read with quite the same flavor as the way he read them. He was completely at home with his own words, and it was really an experience listening to him. And the second thing I want to say is that in some way the connect with my own work is that I saw how he could bring colloquial Indian words and idiom and a whole different kind of voice to English poetry, breaking away from the earlier very orientalist formal way and a very intense emotional way of writing poetry that was popular, and the kind of sharpness and acuity, the irony, and as well as the tenderness that came through his poetry. It moved me very much, and somewhere subconsciously, because I'm a practicing translator, I think and work across languages, and that seeps into my own poetry. But somewhere these inflections and this mingling of languages or words and phrases from other places, from what is not pure English, the kind of impure language that became uniquely recognized as Ezekiel's version of Indian English. I think that definitely somewhere influenced me. And I had been teaching Ezekiel's poetry to mostly students who were not students of English honors as a college teacher. And it was wonderful to see how Night of the Scorpions spoke to everyone. And they could recognize the blend of superstition and science, and they could relate to the scenario that the poem evokes so powerfully. So those have been my personal experiences and my encounters with Ezekiel's poetry. And with that, very briefly, I will present 2 or 3 poems of my own. I was just thinking, since I'm talking of the mingling of languages, I will read a poem which is about something very Indian, and it's something I saw as a child from early childhood in my great-grandmother's home, which is the pandan and the role that pan plays in a Bengali household. and how much goes into that pandan, that box which contains the pan, what the preparation, consumption, and enjoyment of pan actually can signify about the lives of women at a certain time. And how I, as a child, was fascinated by my grandmother's ritual of making pan. But how as an older woman, I thought about the lives of women in her times and how in their secluded lives the pan ritual played a very important role. So this poem is called The Casket of Secret Stories. And it does have some Bangla expressions, but I know that you will understand them. Casket of Secret Stories. Pane Bata, bell metal casket that once held grandmother's gossip, spicy rumors of desire, heartbreak, longing, loss, rolled in lime-smeared pan, betel leaf flavored with shukuri, lobongo, elach, and sometimes a dash of dokka, forbidden tobacco, loaded with sin, mouth-watering ritual, daily rite of chewing with relish upon secret morsels of women's inner lives. In the delicious telling, bright red juice trickling from the mouth, staining tongue and teeth, savoring the covert knowledge of what life felt like in the dark corners of the home's secluded inner quarters. What the world on the outside looked like from behind veils, screens, barred windows and closed courtyards, where women's days began and ended, leaving for posterity this precious, closed, kasha casket, redolent with the aroma of lost stories. And I'll read one more poem, which is called Uprooted, and it's as much about human displacement as it is about the uprooting of trees. Uprooted. Fallen tree on concrete sidewalk, thirsty roots clawing the air, screaming silently for the succor of their own familiar soil. Where all these years I saw you live and grow, blossom and bear fruit and spread your shade, while in your green branches joyous songbirds nested. Fallen tree, forgotten forbear, uprooted to make way for the merciless coldness of concrete. Your plight robs me of my breath. I remember now my human ancestors, uprooted like you from native soil, by the concrete hard harshness of a land divided under foreign rule, displaced persons forced to find new homes on alien, unfamiliar soil. In a different world, indifferent to the fate of trees or men who stand in the way of progress, the high road of history. Dispensable, left to live or die in a world where the climate has changed. Fallen tree, your exposed roots lay bare the callousness of our world, which destroys trees, fish, birds, people, and our own ancestral roots. To build in steel, concrete, and plastic its developing story of growth, even as it blindly digs its own grave. Thank you.
Thank you, Radha. And I now invite the last speaker in this section, Anjana Mehra, to make a presentation.
Good afternoon, Professor Ram, Professor Anisur Rahman. Thank you so much, Sahitya Akademi, for giving me this wonderful opportunity to participate in what is a celebration of someone who I think without whom Indian poetry in English perhaps would not be what it is today. So I'm going to begin by making two completely unrelated points, but I hope you will see the relationship later. I'm thinking first of Horace, and I'm thinking of Ars Poetica, and I'm also thinking about Horace reminding us that each of us needs to develop what he calls in translation a hedonic calculus, so that every time we are faced with a choice, we should have some kind of a moral yardstick by which we can judge what we should do and what we shouldn't. And of course, he was saying that in the context of poetry and the education of, at that time, young men. I'm also thinking, secondly, about Émile Zola. And I'm thinking about, this is roughly 100 years, well, 80 years before Ezekiel was born. And I'm thinking about the publication of Thérèse Raquin and the kind of controversy that it faces. And then the preface that Zola will write to the second edition of this book. The book that has, without any social media, coincidentally the Olympics are being played out in Paris, and that's where this book is played out as well, on the banks of the Seine. And without any social media at all, this book is an instant bestseller because of its controversial content. And in fact, there's a huge section of the reading public that would like to ban the book and perhaps crucify Zola in more ways than one, right? For the salacious and vulgar pornography that he has published. Zola doesn't defend himself, but he does say something that I believe is apposite for our reading of Nissim Ezekiel. And Zola says that he approaches his writing and his characters very much like a surgeon in a hospital when he is operating upon somebody who is sick, or very much like a painter who is painting a nude and trying to represent her on canvas. And he says, you know, for me it's a completely scientific exercise because the person in front of me is not a person, right? They are representative of a particular psychology and temperament. The reason I make these 2 points is because I think that the first major impact, in my opinion, that Ezekiel makes on Indian English poetry is the impact of perspective. This comes from Ezekiel's training, I believe, in painting. This comes from the fact that he worked in perhaps the oldest framing company in the whole country, the Chemol Art Gallery, right? And also comes from his ability to be able to adopt a point of view or a perspective from which he looks at the subject that he's creating his poem about. Finally, before I enter my tribute to Ezekiel, I think Ezekiel presents to us a very, very interesting and important pedagogical opportunity. And that opportunity, and Sudeep, I think, will empathize with the point I'm making, this huge temptation to confuse the poet and the persona, right? Where we always think about the I in the poem as the biography or the autobiography of the poet. I think Ezekiel has presented to me over the years. I've been teaching Ezekiel for as long as he's been in the syllabus of Delhi University, of which unfortunately he is no longer a part, at least of the honors syllabus. Every time there is a wonderful opportunity to think about how Ezekiel the man and the persona in the poem are not the same person, right? And this is a really crucial teaching moment for our students who read so much on social media about Ezekiel. A lot of it is apocryphal, right? But they do tend to think about the I in every poem as the poet. And I think one of the most interesting discussions that I've ever had with my students at Gargi while teaching The Night of the Scorpion is about the gender identity of the narrator of the poem. Because in every single essay that you read on The Night of the Scorpion, the assumption is that it is a young boy. But there is nothing in the poem to indicate that. Nothing at all, right? So we did have, I think, more than one tutorial discussing how it could very well be a young girl and how the meaning of the entire poem changes if you think about the I, the narrator, talking about her mother that was stung by a scorpion and the impact that it would have had. Alright, so after these, I hope poetically connected preliminary remarks, I'm going to begin my tribute to the man whose birth centenary we will be celebrating in less than 4 months, right? And I'm also thinking about how we are not in Delhi in a season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, but we are in the season of mangoes, fortunately, still, right? So I'm going to begin my tribute with a personal favorite of mine, okay? One of the concluding poems in his collected works, to see how Ezekiel tried to bring about the kind of stability that Horace talked about in Ars Poetica, that Emile Zola talks about in the preface I mentioned, and something that perhaps Ezekiel is trying to balance after the romantic excesses of pre-independence poetry. Okay, so perhaps. And what I am quoting from one of Ezekiel's poems, so what he calls the golden mean between the elan of desire and the rational faculties, and how he's able to achieve that. And this is from the poem on an African mask, and he says, in the passion of mind or heart, acquire the equilibrium of art. Okay, and what I wanted to quote, and as I said, this is my absolute favorite excerpt from Ezekiel. This is from Edinburgh Interlude, and the section is called Mangoes. I have not come to Edinburgh to remember Bombay mangoes, but I remember them even as I look at the monument to Sir Walter Scott, or stroll along in the hermitage of Baird. Perhaps it is not the mangoes that my eyes and tongue long for, but Bombay as the fruit on which I've lived, winning and losing my little life. So in this tribute, what I'm planning to do is touch upon some aspects of Ezekiel's oeuvre of the 240 poems available to us. The 240 poems, I should say, which were published during his lifetime. And in this latest collection of his collected poems, there is one more poem that was apparently discovered later, among his belongings later. Okay. And his negotiations with the creative and linguistic medium, and also his perspectives on the cultural landscape of his poetic universe. English is the first and only language used by Ezekiel in his poetry, right? He used a little bit of Marathi, he helped in some translation, but in his poetry, he only ever wrote in English. So his primary aesthetic concern is not with that endless debate in Indian English poetry, should Indians write in English or not, but his concern, as Professor Rahman mentioned in the morning, is with prosody and perspective. Those are his primary concerns. He does, however, make the occasional reference to the fact of his alienation from his surroundings. And this is a point that has been made by more than one person since the morning. Most of the people touched upon his Bene Israeli Jewish identity as being perhaps a cause of this alienation. I would take a slightly different perspective on this, and I do believe that a part of the alienation came from the very different linguistic universe that he inhabited. And being a person who spent his life with language, I think part of this in Ezekiel's alienation comes from the predominantly Marathi and Hindi environment in which he was writing his poetry in English. And he does say in Minority Poem, a different section was quoted earlier, it's the language really separates whatever else is shared. In other poems, he talks about the difficulty he has in communicating with others and how much is always distant, out of reach when he is talking to others. This is the problem he faces in speech and silence when he says, and I quote, Man is alone and cannot tell the simplest thing to any friend. All speech is to oneself. Others overhear and miss the meaning. And yet, to speak is good. A man is purified through speech alone, asserting his identity in all that people say and do. Unquote. The poet also refers in two of his poems to the kind of communication that does not need words to be mutually intelligible to its interlocutors. In the first of these, called Three Women, he writes of how the language of food and love has a universality that transcends both time and space. And I quote, "They spoke the language of food and love naturally as a mother tongue. No problem here of accent or of intonation. The simplicity, the directness, the elation of the food love offered serve as a norm for all my life's daily hell or heaven improvised, missing or attaining form." Unquote. The next poem where he makes a similar reference is for Satish Gujral, and Ezekiel writes, "Deaf artists all of us who martyr the meaning in the flux to lonely and heated visions, whoring after truth. Mea culpa, punish me. It is the task of love and imagination to hear what can't be heard when everybody speaks." Unquote. Another dimension of this negotiation is when Ezekiel distinguishes between a poem and poetry, and he says in the eponymous poem Poetry, "A poem is an episode completed in an hour or two," just like the conference is an episode which will be completed in 2 days, but Ezekiel lives on and hopefully will live on forever. A poem is an episode completed in an hour or two, but poetry is something more. It is the why, the how, the what, the flow from which a poem comes, in which the savage and the singular are all dissolved. The residue is what you read as a poem. The rest flows and is poetry." Unquote. To best understand the stance or perspective that I mentioned at the outset, that Ezekiel believes is necessary to give voice to a poet's experiences and emotions, that he seeks to communicate with lucidity to his readers, or to find, if you like, the exact name, it would be interesting to mark the milestones of this enterprise, to extrapolate from the title of one of his poems, by reading the poems in chronological order of publication, and I assume composition. In the process, I also hope to share some keystones of the poet's credo on writing poetry in English in India. The eponymous opening line in the first collection, A Time to Change, 1952, encompasses some illuminating excerpts. "He has to build something with able hands and knowing eyes, with some instruction from his parents, ancestors, and friends, altered slightly here and there to suit his strength. The pure invention of the perfect poem, precise communication of a thought, love reciprocated to a quiver, flawless doctrines, certainty of God, these are merely dreams. But I am human and must testify to what they mean. For consider how I win redemption in the private country of my mind." The poem in emptiness signals a coming to terms of sort when he says, "Acquainted with the intricate, bizarre movements of the heart, inopportune desire, resentment of a service rendered, I am waiting now in emptiness, annulled, cancelled, made a blank, resolved to find another way." And the only way out of this state of tongue-tied inertia seems to be, let me always feel the presence of the golden mean between the elan of desire and the rational faculties, brooding on design and color, even in this emptiness. Here then we have a prelude to the echo of the language and food and love, which we will hear in a later poem that I referred to earlier, when in something to pursue we are urged. Excuse me. One must be out of doors, also within. Break the barricades of pettiness and pride. Overcome the schizophrenic agonies and dive into the present tense, making for the friendly land of unambiguous speech, or corn and wine. When arriving at the unity of thought, sensation, purpose, deed, suffering is made to sing. Will we be satisfied to find the thing and take it as the tragic view? The answer is, there shall be no more questions, no more expenditure of doubt, but only a limpid style of life whose texture is poetry. The very next year heralds the publication of Ezekiel's second collection called 60 Poems, 1953. And this starts with a poem of dedication, where from the basement room, the poetic persona contemplates his endeavors and declares, I do not want the yogi's concentration. I do not want the perfect charity of saints, nor the tyrant's endless power. I want a humble balance, humanly acquired, fruitful in the common hour. This common hour will hallmark the next phase of his poetic journey, and he can write luxuriously in portrait. A rough and tumble view of things, a damned, impertinent, ironic view of things, a hell-make-air, delightful view of things. 5 years later, in 1958, is published the third, which opens with another portrait in which, beneath his daily strategy, reflected in his suffering face, I see his dim identity, a small, deserted, holy place. This place has become holy with its reconciliation, albeit temporary, of desire and reason. For nothing can be hidden long from heart or intellect. To each, the other's fantasy is plain in retrospect, but welded, they could seem and be a single architect. That is why in the poem conclusion he can write, the true business of living is seeing, touching, kissing, the epic of walking in the street and loving on the bed. As the journey progresses, uncertainty is what frightens me, writes the poet, when he thinks with existential doubt about the language of lovers. I quote, poetry, some foolish critic said, is the natural language of lovers. Looking at her destroyed even my prose. Prodigious music of our silences, dry-throated suffering and helplessness. This is the natural language of love, unquote. The search continues in the appositely titled collection, The Unfinished Man, published in 1960. An enterprise reminds him that home is where we have to earn our grace. And then on a morning walk, he acknowledges that his native place he could not shun, but the more he stared, the less he saw. And the pain of his fragmented view compels him in morning prayer to petition, God, grant me certainty in kinship with the sky, air, fire, earth and sea, and the fresh inward eye. The search is now focused in the next collection on finding the exact name, 1965, and the objective correlative for this becomes poet, lover, bird watcher, which many speakers since the morning have referred to. But I am going to read out a short excerpt which has not been quoted till now. The best poets wait for words. The hunt is not an exercise of will, but patient love relaxing on a hill, to note the movement of a timid wing, until the one who knows that she is loved no longer waits, but risks surrendering. In this, I beg your pardon, in this the poet finds his moral proved, who never spoke before his spirit moved. The next collection, Poems, contains a score of poems written between 1965 and 1974, and a small summit is reached when the writer wonders, do I belong, I wonder, to the common plane? A bitter thought. I know that I would rather suffer somewhere else than be at home among the accepted styles. In poems written in 1974, the metacognitive contemplation of the act of writing, a metonym for the act of creation itself, takes on a sharper focus, and he will remind us that language is our conspicuous gift. The word made flesh is sought again. As the journey draws to a close, we have in Hymns of Darkness, published in 1976, and this is his anti-penultimate collection, the much anthologized and studied background casually. And I quote a short excerpt from it. I have made my commitments now. This is one, to stay where I am as others choose to keep themselves in some remote and backward place. My backward place is where I am, unquote. As I reach the end of this tribute, scripted in all humility and with profound admiration and love for Nissim Ezekiel, I will return to Edinburgh interlude in his ultimate collection, simply titled Poems, 1983 to 1988. This time to the 28th section, which is interestingly called Nothing to Say, and let you hear the poet's final published words. When I have nothing to say, I know I should say it gratefully, as persistent and poetic as the grass that grows between Bombay's pavement tiles. I may be allowed the liberty of quoting from Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 to bring my dedication to a poetic close. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Thank you, Nissim Ezekiel, for the legacy.
You had 3 presentations, and I'm sure there are questions. So we have how much time? 15 minutes? Half an hour. It's a lot of time. So there are lots of questions are welcome. Please go ahead. Yes?
So this is for Anjana, and
Speak up a little louder.
Keep giving them.
So my question is to Anjana. You've looked at a lot of Ezekiel's work, which which is inward-looking, existential, as well as forging a new idiom for Indian English poetry. But something like the tonal variation, the irony, and the range of a poem like Goodbye to Miss Pushpa T.S. Because I've heard people saying that isn't he being very contemptuous, and he's talking down the voice in the poem particularly, which is often aspiring English speaker.
Right.
But I think there's a social range of Jane Austen, in a poem like this, and I've been using it for my teaching. Would you like to comment?
So I think I'm audible enough, so I don't need the mic.
Thank you for the question, Meenakshi. So there are 3 points I'd like to make in response to that. Number 1, again, reflecting on and acknowledging the validity of a point made by Professor Nissim Rahman in the morning. All the critical work that we have come across, and we still come across on Ezekiel, does pay a lot of attention to the content and the indigenizing of the content of his poetry, a bit like what is done, unfortunately, in most cases with R.K. Narayan, without paying too much attention to how the malleability of the language actually is something that the writer achieved. So my focus and target in this tribute was to look at how the idiom of poetry actually changes with Ezekiel. And number one, a related point also I think is that it's a really hard, it's a very tough job being a pioneer of a form, because you are not completely being able to cut the umbilical cord with your literary grandmothers, if you like, okay, to quote Virginia Woolf out of context. At the same time, you are determined that, the backward-looking part of your Janus face will be more in shadow and the forward-looking part of your Janus face will be more illuminated. So I think Ezekiel was also making an attempt, right, to carry forward a tradition and then transform it. Not to just say, throw out all the babies with all the bathwater that there was. Right? That was number two. And number three, I think as far as I'm concerned, the debt that all contemporary poets, including Sudeep, pay to Ezekiel is this discipline of form. Because a lot of the really good poetry, and I will include Sudeep's in that, not because you are present, but genuinely as a reader and a critic, a lot of the best poetry coming out from the ink of Indian writers, yes, is where there has been fabulous amounts of training, right, in the form before you find your own voice. And I think that is not an area of Ezekiel's contribution that has been given enough credit. Hence, the focus on a very small part of his book.
More questions?
Any more questions?
Yes, Meenakshi.
My question is to Vinita. And the very difficult task that you have taken on, as I could make out, of being an editor of Kavita Ezekiel's biography of her father. And as we know from our reading and also from the interview that she was kind enough to record for the Sahitya Academy, that she herself is a poet. And as you said, that it was a very candid biography, but you as a reader, as a fellow poet, as a person in some ways emotional about what you were reading, what were your editorial strategies in that situation?
So this was not an editorial job per se. It was more like she brought this sheaf of papers that, poetry speaking, they were all literature. So she brought them to me and she says, just read this, put them together, make it look like a book, and write a foreword for it. So I as an editor had a very different role to play in this book. This is entirely her baby. It's her very emotional tribute to her father, more than a daughter to a poet. It's more like a daughter-father tribute. So my role is very different, and I completely understood that, recognized that, and I embraced this new editorial profile that I was entering. So I read it like a normal reader would, like any of us here would read a book like that, a memoir anthology like that. And then I responded to it from my editorial instincts. And I was very, very, like rightly said, very emotionally moved by the story. I'm sure all of us will be when we read it. And my foreword sort of reflects that. It's also like a supplement to this very emotional tribute that she's given. So I have not actually edited the book in the formal sense of the word. I've simply put it together, made it look like a book, and written the foreword for it. That's been a very different contribution.
Yes, Sudeep. Sudeep.
It's a query to you, in fact, Nilita. You've known Nissim for a long, long time personally. I mean, I remember the last time was in your house when we had dinner. I forgot that he said that he will sleep on the couch and not go home. My question to you as well as all the academics present here is simply, why is it that Indian academics, when they are teaching poetry, rarely touch upon prosody and craft? Is it because it's a hard thing to teach? Is it because the academics are lazy not to get into the breaking up all the syllabics of each poem, which is hard work, as we all know? They teach it as if they're teaching novelists, which is basically telling the story of the poem and putting them in a social context. Why is this jijak or the hesitancy? And it's for all of you, but I'm asking you first because you know him very, very well. With the foregrounding that when you actually sit down and talk to him, he's so keen on this subject, prosody and craft, as well as the rigor of criticism.
Some of us focus on the prosody and the rhythm and the rhyme and the alliteration, and some of us don't. So I don't know whether we have colleagues who are lazy or they just don't feel up to the mark to do it. Because when I was a student, we had a full 100 marks paper on prosody, and that has been scrapped at least long back at the Bombay University. I don't know what's happened to the paper at other universities around the country. So if the professor of English, if the lecturer in English herself is not trained in doing this, how do you expect her to teach poetry, or how to break up the poem into, even to know, sonnet. Today at least there is something called a Wikipedia or something. You go there and you see, oh, it's got how many lines in a sonnet and how many types of sonnets. But I think earlier, very few of the teachers would even actually know what is a sonnet. They might have learned it long back and they might have forgotten, and they kind of gloss over it. So it's unfortunate, but it happens. And I think Anis wants to add to it.
Thank you, Sudhir, for a very pertinent question that you have raised. It concerns all of us. It's a matter of concern also. As a teacher of poetry, I have been teaching poetry all through. I haven't taught any fiction. Some fiction I taught sometimes. I entirely agree what you said. It has been rather easy teaching fiction, whosoever taught it, because one of my friends said ultimately you end up telling the stories and there your classes on. So thank God I never taught fiction, hardly ever. But I taught poetry. And my basic intent in teaching poetry was to find the diction, not the language. Because diction is a selection from the language, and this is what I try to distinguish and taught my students, that don't take diction as language. This is one point. But this diction, where does it come from? It comes from certain kind of sound. And my training in sound is not from the English poetry. My training in sound is from Urdu poetry. You cannot write Urdu poetry and understand Urdu poetry at all if you have no sensitive ears to understand the rhythm of that. There is one thing called meter in Urdu, it is known as Bhavan. Now if there is one small, say, slippage in that Bhavan, that is meter, then your line goes out of sound pattern, certain sound pattern. So this training that came to me came from the Urdu ghazal poetry, and that is what I brought to use in my teaching of English poetry in my classroom. And that is what ultimately made me a teacher of poetry. I don't know how far I succeeded, but I did try to understand the sound of a poem. Ezekiel makes sense to me because the sound of the poem is very important in this poetry. The one that we have just quoted, how the poem, and especially the bird lover and bird watcher. There is certain rhythm in all these, especially those poems where you have typically Indian poems written in English, Indian language, especially using different continuous tense. These are all patterns of sound. As far as the teaching of prosody is concerned, you are very right. We also were taught this willingly and willingly. We attended the class. Kalika Indian Chatterjee, who taught us, and poor soul. He must be a very disappointed person because we used to go in that class. But later I realized how important it was to understand the prosodic norms of the poem, of the line that one was trying to read. And I also understand one thing, that to be able to, and this is something which is not academic at all, to be able to teach poetry you also have to be some kind of a poet, good or bad. And if you are, you know what it really means. And I was trying my hand on writing poetry both in English and Urdu, which I discovered later that I was too in a position to do something in both the languages, and I, whatever, good or bad, I'm not saying that. But you are very right in saying that the academics have not been very particular about the sound and the diction.
Just to pursue that point, because we brought up Urdu poetry, you see, as Indian writers, here we're talking about English language writing and you write in English and I write and all that sort of stuff. It just baffles me because as an Indian growing up in Delhi, as an, Hindi and Bangla for me were equally important languages. So it's not as though we are divorced from the tradition of sound and meter. It's just this, I think I use the word laziness out of annoyance, because it is laziness. It is, as you say, when you say Wikipedia didn't exist. Wikipedia didn't exist when I was growing up. But how does one know sonnet? Because if you're reading 5 different kinds of sonnet, you realize there are 5 or 6 different kinds of sonnets. The Alexandrian, the Spencerian, the Shakespearean. There's so many kinds. And that's just a Western form. Then you have the Indian form. So it's not as though we don't grow up in it. Our grandparents and parents are reciting the prayers in the puja room, which are very metrical. All the classical dances you see on stage are sung to very metrical songs. So we are not divorced. It is not alien. In fact, if anything, the Indian cultural scene and linguistic scene is much more prosodically alive and indebted to form and structure than what you see. So I'm just baffled, being a poet, being an Indian, being a Hindi speaker.
I suppose there is very little attempt at relating the two, the English poetry that you are teaching and the Indian tradition, the sound traditions in which you are grown up. So there isn't always an attempt to relate the two. Jerry has a question.
I just wanted to say that when you're studying English,
just to point out that when we are dealing with English, we are dealing with a variety of Englishes in India. And therefore, the way the prosody of Ezekiel, read by an Ahomia teacher and read by a Malayali teacher, is going to be different. Now, when you consider that, take the same poem and see whether you can get someone saying emergency for emergency's sake. If the teacher is saying that, where does the stress mark go? Then how do you point out to your teacher that she's got the stress mark wrong because she's saying it wrong? All this is actually part of the lived experience of teaching prosody. And it is not laziness. It is about a genuine difficulty in finding prosody when you are not sure of the interior music of that language, because that interior music is not playing in your head at the same number of beats. Which is it? Emergency or emergency? And if you take what happened to Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak recently over the pronunciation of a name, you can see that you're already entering a minefield if some teacher is to tell a student, you did not get that pronunciation right. So while we are all here speaking a kind of neutral BBC English to each other, we are talking to each other in a cocoon that ignores the reality of teaching English in a classroom with I remember going to Bangalore, to interior Mariamapura in Bangalore, where a teacher was reading out R-A-D-I-O, Radaio, okay, to the students. Now what do you do with a Radaio that turns up in a metrically sound Ezekiel poem?
before we talk laziness or we say, oh, we dropped it, you've got to recognize that we are in a polyglot country that will not allow the BBC's pronunciation anymore. It's out of the window. That ship has sailed. And now the question is, how do I deal with prosody in Englishes?
We have stopped teaching prosody. It's not just
Very good reason.
Yeah.
Very good reason, because tomorrow if you actually have a prosody class, whose prosody will you follow?
We are talking
If
about
you
the
are
old time
in a
teachers
JNU
of
class
English.
where there is an Ahomia child and a Malayali boy and a Kokri girl, whose prosody will you follow when you are doing the beats?
I don't know.
You have to actually then set down the law and say, I'll tell you the prosody. That returns us to the hierarchical state where teacher decides. If the teacher is a Punjabi, then the Punjabi prosody becomes everyone's prosody. And that's pure, simple wrong. It can't be. We've got to accept that certain things have to be experienced. They are experiential learning. And reading a poem aloud, which has stopped in schools, is the beginning of the break of the experience.
Anyone wants to contribute to this?
May I?
Yes.
We were talking about form and structure also, and as a teacher who's put in almost 5 decades in the profession, I was simmering a little at the undercurrent of laziness that's big mention. I would also like to point out that when we are talking about form and structure of a poem, we do talk about it in the classroom, it's not a secret. But what about the poets? What about the self-professed poets who like to, who say they are a poet even before they publish one collection of poems? And I have served as in a position where I had hundreds of poems coming to me for several anthologies, and I find that most of them were upcoming self-styled poets who felt that breaking up a line into small pieces makes a poem. Now, I would say that is sheer laziness. You want to write a poem, at least first learn the trade. Learn the trade, know what meter is, know what rhyme is, know what rhythm is, and then go ahead and choose what you want to write. Whether you want to write it in a formal way or in a free verse. So laziness is both sides to me, not just with the teachers but with the poets also. And I get very annoyed. When I see poems there was one collection of sonnets that came to me, and each sonnet was different from the other two, nothing at all. One had 50 lines, another had 27 lines, a third had something else, and there was no breaking up into regular stanza, nothing at all. So what do you do with something like that? And if you have enough admirers, if you have enough fans, if you have enough people reviewing your books in newspapers, you become a celebrity. You have book launches, you can do what you like, it's so easy. But let's get over this laziness and learn our craft before we start to practice. That's what I would like to say.
Radha would like to contribute. Is there a question?
Is there a response, or may I ask another question? May I ask a question? Okay. Thank you, Leah, for a very interesting paper. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So, my question is that, of course, debates around whether we should be trying to see the poet in the poem or not, right? So you spoke of the poet versus the persona, and you spoke about one poem. Today, listening to so many of the participants talking about their experiences or knowing Ezekiel so well, one does try to understand then the person also. So in this poet versus persona, episode which you're saying, if you look at other poems, did you find that is the poetic voice really the poet himself, or is it more of a persona?
So that's a really lovely question to which I'm not sure that I have a good answer, but I will attempt. And I am not, I will begin by saying, Professor Ramana, I can't write poetry, but I am a great lover of poetry, so that's my only qualification for being a teacher of poetry, is that I read a lot of poetry. I've never written any, I've never published any in my life. If I am to, if Ezekiel the man is the I of his poems, it would be such a tempting and convenient way for the students to answer every question on Ezekiel, right? Because they would imagine that everything that has ever happened to him is being reflected in the poems, everything that is being said in the poem must have happened to him. And background casually, I think, where he describes a Jewish wedding, right? Or a wedding following the Jewish traditions, I think is a really good example to use over here, because it would be so convenient to think about the couple in that poem as being Ezekiel and his wife and subsequent. But I think it's a quicksand which personally I would never want to enter, right? Because in some ways I think I am doing injustice to the imaginative potential of the poet himself, assuming that he can only, and I'm using he only because it's Ezekiel, assuming that he can only write about things that he has personally experienced. That's number one. Number two, however out of fashion objective correlative might be, right? But I do believe that it is important for the poet to be able to not emotionally detach, but separate himself from the experience before he can communicate the experience effectively to someone else. And the only simple logic I have for that is trying to explain to the students how I can make them howl with despair over a broken love affair when they don't know either of the protagonists. And I can only do that if I'm able to put it out there and describe it as vividly as possible. So I would hold to that I don't think the eye is fascinating as the personal reminiscences about Ezekiel have been from the morning, but I am convinced that Ezekiel was too much a master of his craft to write only autobiographies in his poetry.
This is for Professor Rabindra. You said that you are not the appropriate person for what you said, but I understand this was a wonderful presentation that you made. Much appreciated. What I wanted to find out, in fact, to develop a conversation if possible around that, you have two languages to handle, Bangla and English, as a translator, as a critic, as a reader, and also as a writer. Now, we often in the classroom and outside the classroom, and then we do this academic practice by writing a critical piece. For us, being a multilingual people or living in a multilingual state, the issues are very difficult for us to handle. There is a text created by someone. I am adopting that text and trying to do it in my own language. Similar is the case with you and many of us who are sitting in this hall. How do you and I and most of us who translate and converse and try to develop a dialogue between languages and authors? Because even if you translate that particular author, my understanding is that you learn your language while you translate, your own native language, my Urdu and your Bangla. And Bangla, which I can understand because my grandparents have been in the world for a long time, so part of it I can very good understand, though can't speak. So how do you negotiate? I'm asking to you as a practitioner and also as a reader, especially of the book that we have done such a wonderful work on. So how do you look at the text that is there in the source language, the one that you are creating, and there is some language within you, some kind of a diction that I often talk about that is within you. So what is the process of negotiation that happens in you as a translator and as a reader? Because what you were trying to say, and you said very successfully, that you were not a student of Ezekiel's poetry as such, but how did you negotiate? Because you made a presentation which made great sense to me. And that is how I want to find out, try to develop a conversation around languages. How do you understand our language? I own Urdu and you use your own Bangla. And when you put it into the garb of another language, how do you do this? Because it is a very complex phenomenon. The text and the reader and the possible reader that you have in mind in different languages, because this English that you and I try to translate into reaches into various corners of this country, and we really don't know how that particular English written from Delhi goes to Rajasthan, to Madhya Pradesh, to whatever. So some of your responses as a practitioner and as a writer in Bangla and English.
Very big question, Professor Nissim. Before I answer it, can I just give one response to Shruti's question and the discussion that was going on? Very briefly, what I just wanted to add is add to the ideas and opinions that we have been hearing, is that perhaps the problem, it is a problem that we are not focusing enough on the sound, the prosody, the technique, the craft of poetry. It is true that it is no longer taught. I know that in my grandparents' time and some time ago, it used to be taught and people were aware of it. We were introduced to it very briefly and then it was dropped. So it was never something we were examined on and therefore it's never something that we really focused on in the classroom. I think what has happened perhaps in the way our system of pedagogy is designed is that there has been a separation of the theoretical and analytical approach to poetry and the performative aspect of poetry, which gets lost a lot of the time. And I think the sound of the poem, the student doesn't think of poetry as something that you also listen to or recite. I think that is a great loss that has happened, and therefore they look at it as a textbook on a written page rather than a spoken word performative medium as well, and a strong element of morality and performativity. That's very quickly what I just wanted to contribute to that discussion. Regarding a very big question about translation, which is really, I'm not sure that it relates to the discussion on Ezekiel. So here I will simply say that I think one carries different languages within oneself, and one is not consciously or rationally switching codes from one language to another. I think translation comes from close and intimate reading, first of all, in the source language of the source text, and then trying to somehow communicate it. I don't know how it happens, but when you think in a different language, then I think, when you switch your way of thinking a different language, it flows in a different language. But I think without reading and immersing yourself and being an intimate reader of a text, you can't really work across languages. And you have to have a ear for languages and not just, as I said, see things on the page. Thank you.
I don't think there are any more questions. And Mr. Kimball, I don't think there are any more questions, and Mr. Kimball is making sign language that we should wind this up. So we'll do that. Thank you very much to all three and to all the questions that we got, making this session so successful. Thank you very much.
So lively a session. Thanks to the chair and thanks to speakers as well. Vintaji, Radhaji and Anjanaji. And thanks to the ones from the audience who actually participated in this session. Thanks a lot. The day ends here with this session, and tomorrow, right at 10 o'clock, we will meet for the third session, New Directions in Indian Poetry in English, which will be chaired by Professor Nissim, and the presentations will be by Abhay K, Rano Unyalaji, and Payal Makas. Thank you all. Meet tomorrow.